Good evening. Welcome to the Dude Talk for tonight. I'm Julie, and I'm going to be talking about working with primary sources and mythology. So I'm going to get started because I don't know how many people are going to be coming along. But just to let you know, last week I wasn't able to do it. We had a bit of a reshuffle of things, and I happened to be away last week at the protest that there was in Canberra, which was really interesting to go to, but it meant that I didn't end up getting a talk done, so sorry about that. But tonight I just felt like I've been looking into some of the poems and different stories and reading more of the cycles of the mythology lately, and I'm really enjoying them, and it's always been part of my practice, and I just thought I would talk about that because I think sometimes we have a tendency to just do the coursework or do what we find in a book and not necessarily try and work it out for ourselves. And I just wanted to talk about how we can do that and engage with the source material in our own ways. So what do I mean when I say a primary source? So a primary source is like word of mouth, I guess. It's the from the horse's mouth. It's like from the people that the thing is about. So it's not like somebody writing about something that someone else said, sort of that chain of information. It's from the source itself. So we could argue that there aren't any primary sources of the ancient Druids at all, because they didn't actually write anything down themselves. But what we can consider a primary source is the mythology that's been written down. Most of them are from around the 12th century and onwards, though some of those claim to have had earlier editions that they were copies of. So all kinds of different myths and things, and there's just such a huge amount of them that it's hard to know where to start sometimes. I'm wanting to talk about this really for new people to Druidry, but I hope it'll be still interesting if you're an old hat with Druidry and know about all of this kind of thing. But for people who are just getting into it, and I know we have quite a lot of people in the group that are like that, how do you engage with the subject matter? Like, do you have to join an order, or can you get into it in a different way by yourself? And I want to say that you can absolutely get into the subject of Druidry in your own way. You can look at the primary sources and the mythology and intuit what that means for you. So a lot of the poetry and stories were written down in that early period by Christian monks. So often we find that some of the stories were changed a bit to include Christian aspects, which can be a little confusing sometimes, but it also gives us a bit of a challenge to try and work out how to understand them in our own ways. There's also, as far as the idea of primary sources goes, there's things like the ethnographies that were written down by the classical authors like Caesar, or there was the ethnographies of Posidonius, which are actually lost to us, but he was a Greek philosopher and ethnographer, and travelled around Celtic lands and wrote quite a lot about the Celts, but we don't actually have his text anymore. We don't have that primary source. We actually just have secondary sources of him. So people writing about what he wrote about. And but that's an interesting source for what the Druids were actually like, and something that can give us some information. So these are probably as close as primary sources as we'll get with these later written down mythologies, and also those ethnographies of the classical authors. But they're still really useful and things that we can use to understand what we're doing, and how to deepen our practice and make it more personal through our own studies of these things. And to deepen and share it with the community as well, because when we have the opportunities to share these ideas, with others, our understanding of the myths just grows, and that's a wonderful thing to do. Certainly, if you are new, I definitely recommend looking at the coursework of groups like OBOD, ADF, and the British Druid Order, and any other ones that you might find. I'm sure they'll be very interesting as well, where they do the same thing. They've been looking at the myths, they've been thinking about practices and how they can be put into our ritual forms or meditations and personal practices and the things that we do to help us in various different ways to understand ourselves and understand the world around us, and to engage with the subject matter in a deep way. So those courses are definitely full of that lovely, inspiring information about the myths. But yeah, there's something really great about going and getting stuck into it yourself, because often the courses will give you just a snippet of a story, or maybe a condensed form or something like that, or maybe they'll just hint at the idea of something or suggest further reading, and getting right into it is an amazing way. Hello everybody that's saying hi to me. Is an amazing way to really understand that sometimes quite bizarre mindset that the people had that were writing these things, and to try and understand where they were coming from and what was important to them. Sometimes the stories are completely on the money for us. They completely make sense straight away and are amazing. Other times it can be a bit of a struggle to work out what the maybe moral message is behind them, and sometimes I found that maybe that's not the point of those stories. They're not necessarily always about morality. They're about all kinds of other things like tribal identification, or the naming of places, or the relationships between different people, or certain rules about society. There's all kinds of different reasons why a story might exist. So yeah, but we can look at them in lots of different ways. So some things to be careful of when we're looking at these sources. So if we're looking at classical authors like the Greeks and the Romans, it's worth bearing in mind that they probably had some biases. They were in a process of taking these lands over, or studying them in order to make themselves feel better about themselves. So they might have had, derogatory descriptions and things like that. So that's worth bearing in mind. They're not necessarily worth taking completely 100% as true. You've got to take them with an eye of discernment. Also, I mentioned already the Christianized stories. There's sometimes parts of them that don't seem like they were fitting right in a pre-Christian story, that the Christian element has been pushed in there to maybe cover up something that the Christians didn't like, or maybe just to shift the moral message of a story to be more palatable for the Christians of the time. Sometimes we come across stories that have been rewritten by people today, sometimes in an attempt to overcome those kinds of problems. There's this book, I don't know if that's going to come around the right way, it might be backwards for you, sorry, but it's The Mammoth Book of Celtic Myths and Legends by Peter Beresford Ellis. It's not the original versions of the stories, so definitely reworkings, but an example is in that one where in telling the children of Lear's story, instead of them at the end meeting a priest and telling their story to the priest and them finding peace through that, he has rewritten the story so that they sing the Song of Amergine and find peace in that, which I thought was really lovely attempt to try and change it. Obviously it's not necessarily the true story of what was originally there before Christianity came along and wrote them down, but those opportunities to rework them can give us maybe a broader understanding of what may have been there. We don't actually know for sure, but that's part of engaging with the myths in the modern time, I suppose. So yeah, so when you're reading, especially these sort of condensed versions of the stories that are a little bit easier to read usually and quite nicely written for a modern ear, and they take away the old languages and things like that and try and make it as simple as possible. They're there's quite a few books that you can come across that are like that, but they tend to be changing the story a little bit from the earliest versions, or it's quite hard to say that there is an authentic version, because even when they were writing them down, there were multiple versions of things, and whether there's a core, like, true historical version of a story isn't necessarily the way that it went. There may have been different versions of the stories in different places, so we don't actually know what an authentic version is. But when we're reading the modern retellings of them, it's really good to get into the introductions or the footnotes that they have with them and see what their explanations are, because often they do change things or add different things here and there, and it's good to know what their rationale was behind doing that. I think I showed this one before, but this one I've really been enjoying as well. The Celtic Myths and Tales, Epic Tales, and it doesn't have an author marked on it, so it must be edited by a bunch of people. Anyway, that one's really nice and has a lot of different stories, and I've really been enjoying how that one is written. But as far as the more sort of authoritative maybe versions go, a couple that are worth getting a hold of is Early Irish Myths and Sagas by Geoffrey Gantz, which is tough going sometimes, but and I think it's really worth if you're going to look at reading the Irish or the Welsh, or I haven't read much of the Scottish, but I assume it's the same with that too. It's worth learning a little bit about pronunciation too, and there's so many resources for that online, where you can find out how to pronounce things, or talk to people and ask them. But yeah, working out how to pronounce things is sometimes just as far as people go with learning the languages of the Celtic people, and that can really be so helpful, even just to get to that point. Being able to read a word in the language and knowing how to pronounce it is quite a challenge, because some of them are quite difficult. But yeah, this one includes stories of Cuchulainn and stories around that story. There's also the Toyn, which is the story of Cuchulainn as well. Yeah, that's very, very interesting, I think, and worth read. There's the Mabinogion, of course. And if you like audio, of course, Dave the Bard has his lovely recordings of the branches of the Mabinogion with songs and things mixed in there, which is a wonderful way to get familiar with the stories. And then perhaps after listening to them for a little while, it will make reading the story a little bit easier, because maybe even simply from a pronunciation perspective, you'll be able to recognise some of those names and learn a bit about it from there. There's also the Fenian cycle, which is about Finn McCool, which has got lots of great stories in it. And I won't go too long on different sources that there are, because there's so many. And as well as the stories, there's also other texts that you can get that are really interesting to have a look at. And I'll give you a link as well. There's a website that you can look at called ancienttexts.org, www.ancienttexts.org. And it's all free to access, and they have so many different texts there that you can have a look through. I'd really recommend having a look at the Book of Taliesin, which has lots of amazing poetry. I think it's from about the 14th century. I didn't check, sorry. But yeah, that's really worth having a look at. And then there's things like the Labor Gabala Iren, which is about it translates as the Book of the Taking of Ireland, or the Book of Invasions. And it's about the different waves of people that came to Ireland, and that's a really amazing one to have a look at. There's the Dinsentius. I'm probably pronouncing these wrong, so if anyone knows the real way to say these ones, I do apologise. But it looks like Dinsentius. And that one's about the naming of different places. There's the Orion Sept, which is the Scholar's Primer. and that one has information about the Ogham in it and the alphabet. There's also, what was the other one? Oh yeah, the Breton laws, which are about all of the different laws that they had in Ireland, about marriage and kingship, and also about different trees and how they could be used, and what the payments were for cutting down different trees and things like that. So there's lots of different sort of levels of what we can look at. There's just so much information out there that we can look at. Okay, so I've only got 5 minutes left. How do we engage with them today? So a lot of us will be working with some of these already with our coursework, but yeah, working out how we can engage with them through our own intuition, the way that we want to do that, really comes from exploring these stories for ourselves and seeing what presents itself to us. We might find in reading a certain poem that it explains in some way to us an insight that'll help us to create a ritual, or maybe inspire a meditation, or maybe there's a little part of a story that's going to inspire a play that we might do at a different seasonal ceremony. And really, all of these things are completely open to our imagination. We're allowed to do things, in this way, in our own way, and find new ways of doing them. And it's really fun to explore that and share it. I want to just share some of the ways that this has come into my practice, that I've experienced other people sharing these things, and how lovely it is. The round of Amagain is something that I talk about in my book, and it was something that I experienced when I was at the Gorseth of Kayabiri in Avebury, and Morgan, my teacher, said that she made it up. So it is based on the poem, but the Song of Amagain. But we'll go around the circle, and each person will say, I am, and say something about the land that they've experienced or connected with. So she's basically taken a poem, taken the idea of the story around that poem, and brought it into the ritual for us to have an experience of that idea in practice. So I think that we can do that in so many different ways, and really our imaginations are unlimited. So other things are like when I was at the Mabon ceremony in Chalice-Well, they had us go around the garden and meet different guardians, and that were part of the story of the Mabon, different animals and creatures through the garden, and find different insights from each one of them. And through that, with people with amazing costumes on, there to tell you a little insight. And it was all based on the story of the Mabon. When we were at Stonehenge for the winter solstice, they did a little play of King Arthur, and Albanathan, and the return of the sun, and the symbolism of Arthur as the return of the sovereign, and things like that. It all came together really beautifully. But just taking that small little part of a story and turning it into a play that was part of a ritual was really moving and meaningful. And you could do that with so many different parts of so many different stories. At Druid Camp in Adelaide, they did when Dave and Kerry and Christopher were there, where they did the Physicians of Mythfire story, and based the ritual that we did and some meditations around the plants of the area, and creating this sacred brew. It was a beautiful thing to see, and that possibility of looking at the stories in order to really immerse ourselves in those stories through ritual is really rewarding. It's great to be able to do that when you're researching it, and to really immerse yourself in it. But then to be able to share that with a group of people as well really just enhances the experience and helps everyone to remember it so much better, because it's speaking to you on that different level. So yeah, I really would encourage you to go and read some of the primary sources, read some of the mythology, and look at what these traditions have, not just in terms of the modern tradition, but in terms of looking directly at what was offered to us, or is offered to us in those ancient texts. So yeah, that ancienttext.org is a really great one to find, and I hope some of the books that I've shown you are interesting. There's also the The Druids Down Under recommended reading file that you can find in our file section of the group, where there's a list of lots of different recommendations that people have made about mythology, but also about all sorts of things. And you're totally welcome to add to that if you'd like to, or pop a comment in the comments of this talk, and I'll add them in, which would be great. So yes, thanks so much for having a listen. I hope that was interesting, and I look forward to talking to you again next time. Bye.